Today I'm going to be talking about a book called Just Research in Contentious Times, Widening the Methodological Imagination. And this book is by Michelle Fine, who is a professor at CUNY, the City University of New York, and looks a lot into social problems, not just educational problems, but really social problems. And the way that she encourages all of us who do research to not only learn more about these topics that are really pressing in our society, but to also impact change in the lives of our most marginalized community members is through something called CPAR, or Critical Participatory Action Research. And so this is something that is meant to kind of subvert the traditional idea of who is an expert. And so typically you see someone who has maybe earned a doctorate degree or is pursuing one, or otherwise has a lot of professional experience in a field, regardless of their personal life experience, right? And so they will, decide on a research question and go into the community and study it. And so the idea behind CPAR is that who is a better expert on someone's life than themselves, right? And so if we want to investigate these communities, we need to, consider the community members themselves as co-investigators, without whom we really can't get the level of insight that we can get with them, right? And so I looked back at, I think the first CPAR study that I had ever read where, I hadn't really heard of it as a term before. And this was a study, it was actually a youth participatory action research project with some high school students who were going to design a college access program for the summer. And so they worked on this over the course of a few months. And were integral in designing the research questions and collecting the data, all the typical steps that you would expect to see with any other kind of research project. But it is highly, highly not only informed by, but also driven by members of the community that, want some kind of change, want some kind of intervention, want some kind of knowledge. And so it really, really interrogates who can produce knowledge and who the expert is. And so something that this study talked about is deparochializing research. So reframing it from an activity that only certain professionals can do to a universal right for people to gain knowledge for the betterment of their lives and communities. And so this really, I think, is important because it takes away the component of research that we see a lot, where the researcher is kind of projecting their own values, expectations, desires, wants, interests onto a community. Right. And so that's where we get I think a lot of these damage narratives, a lot of these deficit models is looking at a community and saying, well, if you only did this like we do in dominant society or with my ethnic group or with my socioeconomic class, then this would solve your problem. And a lot of times those types of projects really rely on assumptions that are not true, or, are not critical. And so it really does, I think, actually more harm to those communities. They'd probably be better off left alone, to be honest. So for all of these reasons, I really started thinking about using CPAR in my own context, in my own intervention for my dissertation. And I wanted to learn more about the actual methodology. I really wanted to know, how do you actually do this? What does it look like? What are the ethical concerns? And I really wanted to see, perspective of someone who has been doing this for a long time. And so initially I was just kind of searching around for books. I didn't have anyone in mind. I hadn't heard of this specific book, but I came upon it and, kind of flipped through, and I thought, okay, this is pretty cool because it gives many different examples, but it's also very, very personal, and kind of takes a narrative structure that I think a lot of research shies away from. Even research that I think claims to be or wants to be critical and very personal. There's always a tone and a voice to the writing that kind of compartmentalizes the reflective part from the actual data collection and looking at themes and analysis and drawing conclusions. And I've always felt like, okay, I did my reflective part before I started this project, so now I can do the project. Like, it almost feels like they're two separate stages. And so what I really liked about this book when I first decided to choose it is that it really doesn't do that. The personal is just woven throughout the whole thing. You actually get a sense of who the author is as a person. And one of the pieces of that is the mistake she made, is the times that she was wrong, which she presents and talks about, because those lessons are important. And so there's a process of working with the community, making sure they're compensated, and, giving them certain, I guess, agency, opportunities to exercise agency that sometimes don't exist elsewhere. So kind of using your privilege as a member of the academy, as a member of a certain race, socioeconomic class, gender, or whatever, that may give you some power within that dynamic to kind of lend some of that to these communities, so that they have something they can walk away with in the immediate, short, and longer term. But also the journey of the researcher and realizing what those assumptions are that would have gone unchecked had they not done a participatory project. And so that's why, I chose the book. That's why when I started reading it, I stuck with it. I got really, really interested in it. And the book basically answers a very broad question, which is, what can we as researchers do to promote social justice? The word just is in the title, Just Researching Contentious Times. And it's really about looking beyond, what's objective truth, what facts are, and into the real lives of people who live it day to day. And so she gives a lot of different examples throughout the book. She talks about some Muslim youth post 9/11. She talks extensively. There's 2 chapters that talk about California schools failing to meet, their responsibility to the communities that they're supposed to be serving, in ways that I really related to a lot as someone who has taught K-12. And, honestly, I think about doing it again all the time. And there was just so much that I related to, that I think if more people could be exposed to this type of research methodology and this way of looking at problems in schools, I think it's something that would really promote a lot of internal accountability, and promote a lot of bottom-up solutions. And so that's really what the book talks about, with all different kinds of groups of people that are essentially marginalized within our society. Women in prison, LGBTQ youth, just many different groups. And something that she talks about in the book that I really appreciated was how this type of research can actually create solidarity across groups. And when I was reading about this, it reminded me of a group here in Los Angeles in South LA called Cadre. I think it's Community Assets, I'm totally blanking on what the acronym stands for, but it's run by an amazing woman named Maisie Chin, who I think is stepping down now. But she is the one that started this in partnership with the parents of South LA, to demand better for their children. And the way that she does this is by empowering the parents as leaders, training them, making sure that they have the skills that they feel they need to make these demands of the schools and actually get different policies passed. And if you look at their theory of change, which is on their website, one of the very first steps in their theory of change has to do with healing racial wounds. And it really recognizes that there is a fraught history within South LA between Latinos and Black families. And that if we're going to win this fight, we do need solidarity. And so one of the first things that they do when they're training these parent leaders is work on healing those racial wounds, work on building that solidarity and recognizing, what we're each experiencing in this fight and the things that we want, which is great schools for our kids who deserve that and have a right to it. Those are the things that we need to focus on here. And so this talk in the book, in Dr. Fine's book about building solidarity, it really reminded me of the work that Maisie Chin is doing with Cadre and, the times that, sometimes we do segregate or self-segregate for great reasons, to create counter spaces, to have places where we can process certain experiences outside of the gaze of another group. And I think that's great. So I'm certainly not against that. But I also really like the way that this is kind of presented as this approach that, asks us to decolonize ourselves and to question, well, if I don't like that this dominant group looks down at me, how can I look down at the next group? How can I sit in judgment of the next group, that's around the corner from me that I share this community with? And so I really like this approach because I think it does a good job of requiring accountability from everyone involved, but also giving something back to everyone involved too. And so I think this is the kind of research that, sometimes it doesn't produce a beautiful Excel spreadsheet with a nice little pie chart and nice, clean, metrics that you can put in the cover of the LA Times that'll just sum up in, a couple of numbers what the impact was. But I do think it's something that can really create a ripple effect throughout a community. And that's why it's so important. And that's why it's something that I wanted to consider for my dissertation. And so I highly recommend this book. I loved it. You do, I think, have to go into it with the mindset that you're not necessarily looking for a traditional, article that you read in a journal that is going to have this like intro, framework, data collection, analysis, themes, conclusion type of structure. It's not like a neat, pretty little package. But what it does is present how Dr. Fine and her colleagues grapple with these ethical questions of doing social research, and how to just constantly improve, which is something that I found really, really valuable. And so I did have a chance to sit down with Dr. Fine, who is very funny, very knowledgeable. Obviously, she has, I think, over 30 years working on projects like this, but also is very approachable and is, I thought, the kind of person that isn't a different person in her research and outside of it. I could really see that there's an authenticity to her, and who she is within her research, that's who she is everywhere. And so I was able to get a lot of really honest and insightful answers from her about this book and about her experiences in this field. So what follows is my conversation with Dr. Fine. Enjoy. Great. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm here with Dr. Michelle Fine. I'm going to read a little bit from her bio and about a book that we're here to discuss today. So Dr. Fine is a distinguished professor of critical psychology, women's studies, social welfare, American studies, and urban education at the Graduate Center at CUNY, which is City University of New York. And she's a founding faculty member of the Public Science Project, a university community research space designed in collaboration with movements for racial and educational justice. As a scholar, expert witness in litigation, a teacher, and an educational activist, her work centers theoretically and epistemically on questions of justice and dignity, privilege and oppression, and how solidarities emerge. And the text that I just finished reading recently, which I really loved, is called Just Research in Contentious Times, Widening the Methodological Imagination. And it's from TC Press and was put out actually about 5 years ago in 2017, but just as relevant today as ever, I think. It's a very personal text. And in this text, which has 6 chapters plus an intro and conclusion, she talks about struggles over the course of 30 years to translate research into policy and practice that can enhance the human condition and create a more just world. Some of the projects the book talks about are CPAR, Critical Participatory Action Research projects with school pushouts, Muslim American youth, queer youth of color, women in prison, and children navigating under-resourced schools. So, was that a good intro, Dr. Fine?
What a great intro. Thank you. Yeah.
So like I mentioned, I just recently finished reading the book, actually chose it for a class assignment. And I'm usually the person that wants to choose my own adventure for class assignments. And I, was just kind of Googling around, seeing what was out there. And I came across this, and the title right away kind of grabbed me. But sometimes that can be misleading. So I was like, okay, let me kind of look more into this, see what it's actually about, kind of scan through. And right away, I really fell in love with just the opportunity to see so many different examples in one place. And so I wanted to start off by just asking, why did you decide to write the book, and why do you think it's important to widen the methodological imagination?
So thank you for that gorgeous introduction. There are 2 ways to answer your question. One is I'm increasingly finding that activists, educators, mobilized groups of youth struggling for justice, and even foundations are increasingly interested in research that's bottom up, that's rooted in the perspectives and the questions of those who have been most impacted by unjust systems. For a long time, social movements were highly suspect, for good reasons, of researchers treating data like low-hanging fruit, there for the grab. It's been a colonial, white supremacist enterprise. And yet, I've been very lucky to find colleagues, comrades, friends, buddies, who want to kind of mobilize quantitative or qualitative research, turn research into lawsuits or performance, into ed psych, into theory. And I work best in community, in solidarity, when there's a kind of asymptote toward justice. Like, you're never quite going to get there, but maybe a little piece of engaging research can help move the needle. So that's one direction. And The other direction is it really comes from some of the questions you were asking. Why so personal?
Mm,
I am really blessed to have many students of color, first-gen students, queer students, folks for whom the Academy was not designed
mm,
in my life and in my family. And I feel like there's been a move to ask people to be reflexive about where do your questions come from,
mm,
and that white cis
mm,
PhD kind of people can still fake it like our questions come from science, from God,
mhm,
from
mhm,
because they're just obviously necessary, when in fact they come from our bellies, from our biographies, from our nightmares, from our own wounds, from our desires, from our privilege, from noticing that our privilege steps on someone else's back.
mhm,
And I realized there weren't many reflexive pieces by white academics that
mhm,
addressed how a critical lens might emerge from a life of relative
mhm,
privilege. And if we're going to be true to doing research on oppression and injustice and struggle,
mhm,
we have two obligations. One is to also call out who's being privileged and how money is flowing toward
mhm,
groups of privilege. And the second is to build research that can expand an imagination for what else is possible. And to
mhm,
do that, we need methods and what I would
mhm,
call epistemic justice. That is, a justice with respect to who produces knowledge, honoring the perspectives of people who've been most impacted, and daring to build kind of research collectives of
mhm.
very differently positioned people, so that we can craft questions to provoke another tomorrow. So I decided to write it, and some of it, as you could tell, came straight from my belly, some
Yeah.
from my head, but yeah.
Mhm. I really love that about the book. I think it was so lyrical and poetic, and that was something I really enjoyed because I think we have all these narratives that are kind of the dominant narrative, and they enjoy a certain type of poetry, the narratives about like the founding of the country and the wild, wild west. And it's a different kind of poetry, but it really is, lore at this point. And I think, sometimes our response to that is to go into that hyper objective mode of just being like, okay, I can counter this with pure black and white science. And I actually really appreciated the impulse that you followed to not do that and to make it very personal.
Thank you. I think I use metaphor.
Yeah.
The publisher said, can you have a paragraph so that not everybody just uses your metaphor? And I don't even realize I do it,
Mhm.
but people commented on it a lot. And I think it's a way, and maybe poets do this. I am not a poet, but
Mhm.
um, it's a way to use language to capture an experience, but
Mhm.
keep it open enough
Mhm.
to invite an aspiring Dr. Youngblood to imagine your experience in my
Mhm.
gauzy sketch.
Mhm.
And so I think that's, for me, the function of the metaphors, that I don't want to deny the experiences I've had, but I also obviously don't want to assume it's the same as yours. But I do find if we can speak at a level that's both rooted in material conditions and slightly poetic abstracted,
Mhm.
that we can come together
Mhm.
toward a different sense of what's generalizable. What are all of our freedom dreams? How do we think about validity? And maybe objectivity is all of us coming together and pooling what we know
Mhm.
rather than acting as though we can strip it out.
Well, you read my mind. I was talking to my partner last night about the book. He was playing a video game, so I think he was just kind of half listening. But I was saying a lot of those same points about abstraction and generalizability and what does it mean. So I feel like you just kind of read my mind with what you were just saying. I really appreciate also what you mentioned about, imagining a better world. Something I say all the time is, a better world is possible. I think we forget sometimes, like we're so beaten down by these systems that are in power, and we kind of forget it is possible. It's not impossible to change things. It just doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen in our silos, in our little corners. And there's a quote that I pull up from time to time. It's actually from a Mexican soccer player. It was during the World Cup, and they were asking him, like, do you really think you guys can beat, I think it was Brazil or something, who was supposed to be, the heavy favorite? And his answer was like, why not? And he said this quote that's kind of been memed, and he said, imaginemos cosas chingonas. Like, let's imagine some incredible things. Let's imagine, like, why limit ourselves to what's already happened? Why limit ourselves to what currently exists? And so that was kind of in my mind throughout the book. And I think, where you went for those possibilities was this collaborative participatory research, instead of saying, like, let me just sit in my office and prescribe what they should do, which, as my background's in linguistics, so I always think about prescriptive and descriptive linguistics. And it's like, why are we telling someone else how to talk, how to act, what they should want, what their dream should be? And so in, I think, the second chapter, you talked about some of these students who are, you called them exiles within. And one of the things you mentioned is that they did offer broad critique of our social systems. They were really aware of things that were unfair and systemically unfair and designed to be unfair. But at the same time, they had kind of internalized blame, for any of their perceived shortcomings, failures, things they should have done differently. And, from your perspective, how do we address this using critical participatory action research? How do you, as a researcher, use that as a tool to mediate that dissonance, those conflicting viewpoints?
Yeah. I guess I want to say many things because you're smart and you just said many things that made me think things. One is about imagination. And I feel as though this is a very hard moment. It's a moment that Massey and Hall might call conjunctural crisis. There are kind of winds coming from multiple directions that are assaulting communities. So if you talk to low-income kids about COVID, it was like one on top of a whole set of crisis. And also so much pride in their communities for mobilizing mutual aid and taking care of my grandma and being home with her and hearing stories from the Dominican Republic that I never heard before because we're home all day. So it's so much more complex than just a trauma or a single oppression. And right now, it's easy to feel like the forces of hierarchy, greed, authoritarianism, misogyny, white supremacy, capitalism, like they're winning. It is easy to feel that way. And so I feel that those of us who are researchers have an obligation not only to document the critique of these systems, but what else is possible. And I learned that from doing work with women in prison, with school pushouts, with queer youth who are living on the streets, with kids in foster care, their own wild, wonderful imaginations and commitments to a world not yet. And so I don't know that it's a contradiction to be critical of the system and self-blaming.
Mhm.
And there are a couple of different possibilities. And really, I learned this from working with women in prison. When we came in and did the project with a participatory research project with women in prison, just for your listeners, we were trying to document the impact of college and prison on the women, their children, their
Mhm.
post-release outcomes, and
Mhm.
the prison itself. And we came in with a very leftist analysis about white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy
Mhm.
and how it has affected these women and the life choices they had.
Mhm.
And many of them, most of them said, that's all true.
Mhm.
And I made a mistake.
Mhm.
And I need you to be able to put both of those together, Michelle.
Mhm.
And I think in the academy, somehow we teach you all,
Mhm.
it's either a structural analysis or agency.
Uh-huh.
And in this country, we're so excited about agency and we deny structure.
Yeah.
But those of us who pay a lot of attention to structure fail to notice
Mhm.
that people want to be responsible for their own lives,
Mhm.
for the joy they create, for the love they make, for the babies they create, for the music, for the education, for the food, and the mistakes.
Mhm.
And to white that out, literally white it out,
Mhm.
is a disservice. People make, I've made a million mistakes.
Mhm.
I haven't had to go to jail for them.
Mhm.
People I'm related to have made a million mistakes. We got them good lawyers. We got them hospital. We got them drug treatment. They didn't have to go to jail for those mistakes.
Mhm.
So the question is not, did we make a mistake?
Mhm.
It's how do we have a racialized class system that
Mhm.
criminalizes some and protects others?
Mhm.
And so when I work with young people, I hear a lot of system critique
Mhm.
and some self-blame, and we do a lot of reading and we do a lot of study, and we
Mhm.
share experiences, and
Mhm.
people begin to recognize, wow, most people who are drug addicts and drug sellers are white and they don't go to prison for that. And now it's a public health crisis
Mhm.
because like
Mhm.
they're white. Um,
Mhm.
So we begin to see the patterns, but I think a real disservice that I have participated in, and we've
Mhm.
taught all of you, is if you blame structure, you don't blame people. And
Mhm.
actually, people are much more generous than that.
Mhm.
And say, I might have screwed up. I'm now doing a wonderful project with a research team of formerly incarcerated women who are survivors of domestic violence, and some lawyers trying to
Mhm.
get women out of prison if they can demonstrate they were being experiencing violence, their sentences potentially can be reduced. And
Mhm.
it's very hard for women in prison to go from I made a terrible mistake to maybe
Mhm.
I deserve justice. And so
Mhm.
there are these peer-led groups inside
Mhm.
helping women understand the law, but also unpack their histories, not deny for most that something terrible happened. But for
Mhm.
women, their narratives are so clogged with
Uh-huh.
blame and guilt and responsibility. And oh my God, a baby
Mhm.
died or someone died, or that it's
Mhm.
very hard to also see I was in a terrible situation. I made some bad choices, but
Mhm.
I've been locked up for 28 years, enough. And so we need to not have victim anyway, all those binaries.
Yeah, well, gosh, I was thinking about so many things as you were talking, because I think a lot of those mindsets of feeling like you can't advocate for yourself, I've experienced as someone who's neurodiverse. I have ADHD and I wasn't diagnosed until recently. And, it was a lot of self-blame my whole life. And it's not that now I don't take responsibility. I'm like, I have a get out of jail free card. It's just that I can understand when to advocate for myself and when I need to do the work within to achieve my own goals. not to meet a societal standard, but to achieve what I'm seeking to achieve. One of the themes that this podcast—
It's just a great example. Thank you. Thank you for introducing that. And it's not that you're not critiquing a very ableist, exclusionary system, but you also know you need that those aren't incompatible. Anyway, keep going.
I mean, one of the things I just did was leave a job where I had a supervisor who's actually on the school board of one of the largest school systems in the country and will be the president in the incoming year, and who literally said, "You're not normal." And it was a moment where in the past I wouldn't have advocated for myself. I wouldn't have quit the job. And even though it did still hurt me to hear that, because it wasn't just her feedback, it was more of like this is what society thinks of you because you didn't understand this thing that the rest of us would have gotten right away. It hurt, but I was like, no more, enough. I'm about to turn 38 this year. Enough. I don't need to be here. Why? I have one life. Why submit myself to this? And that does come with a lot of privilege. I have a partner who's able to support me through that. I wasn't going to starve and be on the street from quitting my job, even though it is hard. But, one of the things that I talk a lot about is failure. And what that word means, and especially to first-gen students, to low-income students, students of color, all these groups, right, that really internalize systemic failure, right? And so they don't want to advocate for themselves because there's always a "but I." Well, yeah, my professor was being sexist, but I, did turn the assignment in late. So I don't really have a right. And I've had this conversation hundreds of times, I feel like by now, of reminding them, you are a human being and your human right. You have a right to dignity. It's the bare minimum. I know the bar is in hell, so it gets skewed sometimes for what we think we deserve, but this is not okay. And you have a right to advocate for yourself and not be ashamed, to stand up and use your voice. And if it turns out you are wrong, it's okay to say, I was wrong about that. You can have both and you can move forward with it. You don't have to punish yourself for the rest of your life.
There's an essay in what you just said, "but I," and as a linguist, you could really look for where that gets used as a kind of literal trump card. Like, "but I tried to get over the border." Are you kidding? Like, and that's a way of not seeing the history, the structure, the constraints. The example you just gave is really beautiful. And part of our job as teachers and as researchers is to make clear that everybody has created, everybody hands in papers late. Everybody. Some get away with it, some feel entitled, some threaten to lawsuits. And I think your example is really strong.
Thank you. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the third and fourth chapters. These were really my favorite. I think just on a personal level, I was so enveloped in them because I think I was projecting all my own K-12 teaching experiences.
That was the invitation.
I mean, I think so much of it is universal. So many teachers are like, yeah, I didn't have enough desks for my students. Yeah, there were legally 10 more students than we're allowed to have in the room and we couldn't do anything about it. And I think also we've all worked with teachers who really openly express a hatred or just this disgust towards their students. And I always wonder, like, how did you get here? Are you a bully and this is what you wanted somewhere within you? Like you knew you couldn't bully other adults, so you kind of subconsciously got yourself somewhere where you felt like you could be in control and be the king or queen of your castle. I've seen so much of that, teachers saying, oh, that kid, that 7-year-old, he'll be a killer, he'll be a murderer one day. And I'm thinking, how the heck do you know what he's gonna be one day? You don't know anything about him, really. And so I know in these chapters, you talked about a lack of public accountability for these issues that just would not be accepted anywhere else. And so I was wondering what that public accountability looks like to you. How should we measure that? Because it's typically external accountability, No Child Left Behind, or these different policy legislation pieces that prescribe a lot of testing.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of guessing that that's not really what you would like to see. So what does
Yeah.
that look like for you?
Yeah, so on a lot of the projects we're involved in, because we're rooted in community,
Mhm,
I don't want to avoid questions of accountability,
mhm,
but I want to queer them. I want to
mhm,
challenge accountable to whom, for what, and how do we know?
mm,
So when I teach research methods, the first assignment is students have to write a letter of accountability to whom is their research accountable.
mm,
And I periodically, not often, students say, I didn't sign up for a course like this. They're usually not from my programs,
mhm,
but they're very beautiful. I ask them, really, first day of research methods, think of who holds your heart.
mhm,
And just jot down, dear so-and-so, I think of you often and I want you to know. And then write for 15 minutes. And so that's one way I think about accountability. And people have written, Camille Lester, who's studying what Black mothers tell their sons about the police. She wrote a letter to Emmett Till's mother. You know,
mhm,
other people have written to an abuela left
mhm,
behind when the family immigrated. Others have written to neighborhoods that are gentrified. A kid they taught in second grade where they tried, but it wasn't enough. A
mhm,
younger self, a future self, an elder, someone long gone.
mhm,
I was working with a group of young people about solitary, who had been through solitary confinement, and a couple of those young people wrote letters to some friends left behind in juvenile facilities during COVID when they knew they weren't testing. And
mhm,
it reminds us that research is an ethical practice,
mhm,
and so that's too simple, but it's one of the ways that I enact it in my teaching. I'm now working on a project. New York State has high stakes testing in order to graduate. So does New Jersey.
Yeah,
We're two
Regents.
of 11 states. I think Arizona still has it too, where you
Mhm.
have to pass a graduation test to
I'm in
graduate. Only
California.
11 states have it,
Mhm,
maybe not
mhm,
Arizona.
mhm,
And it's, it's stupid, it's privatized, it's
mhm,
expensive.
mhm,
Black and brown kids, ELL kids, kids with disability, it's all predictable.
mhm,
And then it's used as like, gotcha. Like it's built with punitive logics
mhm,
and corporate logics, not generative logics. So New
mhm,
York State is interested, maybe courageously, maybe timidly, in getting off that course, but
mhm,
having a deep commitment to public accountability. So I'm
mhm,
helping to work on that and document it. And I'll
mhm,
tell you what we're doing. We're working with schools to encourage what's called performance-based assessments. So students do inquiry projects in math,
mhm,
science,
mhm,
social studies, hold on. And kids develop these inquiry projects in 9th or 10th grade, and then teachers scaffold them.
mhm.
And then at the end, they have to present to an external audience, like a
Yeah.
college professor or another teacher.
Mhm.
And they're beautiful.
Yeah.
Sometimes the work is just stunning and you can't believe they did it.
Yeah.
And other times it's not yet.
Mhm.
And what we say is, your paper's great, but it's not ready.
Mhm.
You still have to go back. You need more evidence. You have to work on the grammar, the spelling. you're going to have to figure out how to have two different points of view and then come back and we'll do it again. And there's kind of a beautiful in these schools, and these are non-selective schools, just regular kids. There's a culture of revision, feedback, and intergenerational commitment to student work. So we're working with those schools. We're looking at student work. We're looking at culturally responsive inquiry. We're looking at who are the external reviewers. And then we're actually tracking for those who attend CUNY, the City University of New York, which is a substantial number of them. How are they doing in terms of persistence, credit accumulation, GPA, graduation, compared to students coming out of test-driven schools? So we call this predictive validity, which seems much more interesting than gotcha, you don't know why the War of 1812 was. And then we looked at it by race, class, language, immigration status. And it won't be a surprise to you, but young people of color coming out of these performance assessment schools who know how to do inquiry, who know how to lean on adults, who know how to revise, who know when they hit a bump in the road, they should trust an adult to help them and not get filled with shame. They're just doing much better in college than the typical kid graduating from a test-driven school. But you know, the chancellor is worried that they take the test away and people will do nothing. And I understand the anxiety. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. But if all we give people is tests as a measure of accountability, it's like all we give people are cops as a measure of safety. And then people say, I want it, because we've deprived their imagination of anything more.
Wow. Again, I have so many thoughts in my mind. You know, one of the first schools I taught at was Kingsbridge High School in the Bronx. I know you have to go. I'm going to wrap it up.
I'm good till a quarter of.
Okay. But yeah, we had
to taught at Kingsbridge. Was that a consortium school?
It was the Walton High School campus. They had just broken it down. You talked about these small schools. And so it was an international high school, which was probably 85% newcomers, recent immigrants from the Dominican Republic, and then kind of a mix of West African students, you know, an Albanian kid here, just, you know, the other 15% was a mix. And I taught global studies and they loved it. They, you know, we talked about the French Revolution. We talked about their Independence Day and what the parallels were. They did a Renaissance fair. They got dressed up.
So you know exactly what I mean. You know exactly. And what happens in those buildings is incredible and never enough. You know the ones who got away. But yeah, that's a way of thinking about accountability as relational, authentic, ethical, culturally engaged, and always a struggle, you know.
Yeah. But one of the things that I saw lacking was that feedback and that revision. So I think you touched, you know, in the book a couple times about teachers being certified and really knowing what they're doing. And, you know, I'm not going to talk down to teachers, but I do know that like when I was thrown in, I didn't know what I was doing yet. And I lacked some of that. Oh gosh, I hate the word rigor, so I don't want to use it, but, you know, some of that, like kind of that back and forth. And when you were talking about that cycle, I was thinking of Bell Hooks and how she talks about love and what that looks like. And a lot of times, and I think in our society, it looks like niceness, right? Like manners, kind of faux respect. For elders or for groups that, you know, you shouldn't question. And what you were talking about, it made me think of love, compassion. And, you know, the last question I wanted to ask you is about that. I think we have very rigid systems and then they're punitive, they're unforgiving, they're unyielding. And then we rely on individuals to sporadically be compassionate and loving. And I wish we kind of, you know, would try to have a compassionate system because then if your student, if your child, or whoever it is, just happens to be in, you know, Miss Smith's class and she's kind of a jerk, like it, you're not like shit out of luck, basically. And so I just wanted to ask you, you know, how you gave a great example with this inquiry-based assessment, but what else do you think we can do to kind of inject our institutions, our systems with more love and compassion?
You know, I spent a lot of time documenting the how and the what of progressive ruptures in punitive systems. So college and prison, performance-based assessment in a regent's system, and restorative justice. And what makes me, so I have two contradictory thoughts. One is that these systems are allergic. I was going to use I was going to say autistic too, and I realized, ew, that's creepy, but like anti-relational, right? And we did a very cool project with a group of young people who identified as neuroqueer and who schooled me about disability justice, and don't use that as a metaphor, and and I am autistic, don't say a person with autism. And it was just like, it's like, I'm not going to apologize for that. And they were saying that, not me. So on the one hand, it sometimes feels like bureaucracy is allergic to care, and on the other hand, I have seen so many educators, counselors, organizers, young people, families swim against the odds. And we're seeing it now. I mean, there are hundreds, it might even be 1,000 Black Lives Matter study groups among teachers around the country. There are restorative justice practices proliferating despite what's happening. There are soccer teams in Florida wearing t-shirts that say gay just because he wants them not to, the joy, the humor, the relentlessness of resistance and desire for dignity, your point, it wins. Right now, it doesn't feel like it's winning, but they never totally flatten us. I mean, Ukraine's a funky example, but it's an example. I don't know if you watch basketball. Did you see?
I went to University of Connecticut, and so yeah, we have a long basketball tradition. So
did you watch March Madness?
I did.
All right, so we are a St. Peter's house. Okay.
Yes.
So like, who would have, like some teacher said that group's not going to go to college and not gonna, they're going to be killers. And they were on the court. They were just relentless. And when they lost last night, it was a heartbreak, but who would have predicted that? And so I guess as much as I see bureaucracy kind of curdle good ideas, I see a relentlessness in educators, organizers, young people, activists, insisting that things be better. And maybe that's just the ongoing struggle. You know, there have been times in my life, and my whiteness has enabled me to believe like, oh, we won, that's over. And my friends of color have always said it's never over. It's coming, you know, I thought reproductive justice was settled. I thought those issues are, so it's a constant struggle. And maybe that's a way to spend a life, to be engaged in constant struggle. And the little piece that we bring with CPAR is to bring evidence from and by the people to document the wisdom that already exists, the freedom dreams that are nourished, and the fact that those dreams are not impossible, but as Arundhati Roy would say, they're just around the corner.
Yeah. Whew, wow. Do you have time for one final question? I don't want
Yeah.
to keep you. Okay. I wanted to give you a chance to respond to a critique that I read. I did look at a couple different book reviews. Most of them were glowing. And then I found this one, which was interesting because it is by Valentina Rada and it's in the Project Management World Journal. And I thought it was interesting that someone in project management looked at this. And she wanted to know more about how your CPAR projects actually improve the lives of participants. And I'm going to read a quote from this review. She said, quote, "Throughout the book, there was a sense of compassion and unfairness for the minorities, and I can surely sympathize with them. I still believe our society should find solution rather than issues." And she goes on to add, "We need to encourage students and minorities to overcome their frustrations and to blend with the rest of society," end quote. So what is your response?
Now I understand. I'll tell you, there's a place where we dramatically disagree, and then I can answer the question. I am not interested in the simulation models. I'm not. Fortunately, I'm a Jew at the margin who's very critical of Israel, very allied with Palestinian justice, but I'm in a group. I've seen what happens when minority and excluded folks, in quotes, are invited in. We shut the door on those we left behind. And so I'm not interested in a seat at the table. I'm interested in transforming the tables so they're circular and inclusive. What do the participants get? The co-researchers get always paid, always food, always Metro cards. They get publication. They sometimes get college credit for some of our projects. If they work with us long enough, we find a college, St. Peter's, CUNY, that will grant them 3 credits. And these kids who never expected to go to college suddenly get a transcript of 3 college. And the ripples are incredible. The percussive consequences of participating in these projects. I don't do it out of compassion or empathy. I do it because we must interrogate systems that have desperately and violently oppressed some communities and elevated others. And we must engage research that takes seriously the perspectives of cats and people who have been most impacted. And only then can we actually have valid and objective and generalizable research, not God's eye view. But the other place I would agree with her is we have taken up some really intractable problems. And we have to mediate expectations. Injustice is not a cognitive problem. It's not like, if only they knew it was unfair, they wouldn't lock people up. If only they knew women didn't like earning less than men or wanted reproductive justice, or if only they knew people of color didn't like being shot by the cops. They know all that. But we bring evidence to a struggle that sits alongside law and organizing. And we build research projects fueled by, to borrow a word you hate and I hate more, rigor, interdisciplinarity, multiple methods, and an obligation to invite the world to imagine how else, to witness the wounds, but also imagine what else is possible. So take that, Dr. Management Projects.
Well, I would say, to summarize, she might have a fundamentally different worldview, but I would encourage her to imaginemos cosas chingonas. Like, let's imagine something beyond a piece of, evidence-based, like our pie chart that we can make from this. And
let them all eat cake.
Yeah. There you
or
go.
all play soccer in Mexico.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Dr. Fine, thank you so much for your time. I know you have to run. This was so inspiring for me, and I'm sure it will be for anyone that listens to this. I feel like
Thank you.
rejuvenated.
Thank you. Thank you. Please call me Michelle, and we
I
will be in
can't.
touch. I would love to see how your work unfolds over time.
Thank you so much.
My
All right.
pleasure. Be well. Be safe.
Thank you. Take care.